Thank you. Mr. Haas, you have in your capacity or prior capacity actually negotiated one of these PPAs, is that correct? More than one?
Yes. Okay.
When you've had a disagreement, and you say that you have to work out, you get the model and then you try to, what's the length of time to try to overcome that disagreement? Does it ever get to the point where you never really do? How have you worked those out in the past?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of experience in negotiating those, Senator. Thank you for the question. It can take quite a long time. It can take months to negotiate the terms of these agreements, of course, and that's where sort of the calculus of weighing the advantages, perhaps, to negotiating better terms for the non-federal sponsor on these agreements. Does it outweigh the potential risk, of course, of not getting a project done or having that project being delayed and those costs being increased or perhaps become infeasible in some way? But in terms of kind of the mechanism for negotiating those, we work very closely with our local district, the New Orleans district, obviously, to try to negotiate those terms. At times, we've had to bring those negotiations to the division and then again up to headquarters often as well.
Have you ever walked away from one? Have you been able to get the disagreements put to rest?
I don't know if we've ever walked away from one. That is a good question. I'm not aware that we have. We have signed many under duress, I would say. But I don't know that we've walked away from it. I'll have to get back with you.
Okay, I was just curious. And then if you were a first-time non-federal partner looking at this, what one piece of advice would you give a first-time applicant to become a partner with the Corps under these circumstances that we have now?
If I might take the liberty of mentioning two things,
of course.
I would say be aware of what other non-federal sponsors around the country are agreeing to. Know what those other agreements look like around the country to learn from those experiences and the negotiations that other non-federal sponsors have gone through. And then secondly, I would say it's imperative to have a very good working relationship with your local district, the district commander. They, of course, are the ones that will elevate disagreements to division and to headquarters, and they can be your best advocates at times. And so having a good, trustful working relationship with the districts is very, very important. Okay,
thank you. This is for the panel. This is on the hold and save language. I mentioned in my opening statement, and we've gone through this, but I'm going to dig down a little bit into it, that the 86 law requires that PPAs to include hold and save language. This language indemnifies the Corps except for when damages are due to the fault or negligence of the Corps. So in thinking about this, I'm trying to think, Mr. Haig, I'll go to you first. What kind of circumstance could occur that would not be fault or negligence that would be an exception where the liability would fall to the non-federal partner?
Thank you for the question.
I mean, I'm just trying to figure out, envision this.
Right. It's a difficult question to answer, I think, with specific examples. When I've talked to lawyers about the hold and save clause, in a lot of ways, they're most worried about those sort of unforeseen and unimaginable instances, which is why it's particularly problematic, because it is a perpetual indemnification of the federal government for any reasons, except where the non-federal sponsor, who has the burden of proof, can show that the Corps was negligent. You know, I think that requirement is particularly problematic for non-federal sponsors for a couple of reasons that you've heard from today, one of which is the Corps does retain a lot of the authority for final decisions around planning and execution of these projects. So when you have a situation of a partnership where one partner has to one partner of the Corps has so much control over project design and execution, and the other partner has to indemnify them and have the burden of proving fault or negligence, that's a really tough balance to swallow for a sponsor, not to mention some of the state law objections that you've heard mentioned as well. So that creates specific challenges for states where those conflicts exist.
Right. Ms. Wallace, do you have any examples or things that you've thought of or your group's thought of that might hold to these exceptions?
Yeah, and I think Mr. Haas can answer that question. I think he's got examples. ICWP doesn't have examples like that we would want to speak to, but I can say from a state perspective that it still would conflict with the constitutional law for states to sign up for an unknown cost at an unknown time for an unknown reason.
Okay, so the states in red that have conflicts, do they still go through with PPAs, or they're just absolutely prohibited because they have to sign this agreement?
Some have, for the same reason that he spoke to, which is that you stand in between a federal resource, federal
Right.
dollars for an important project. But more and more states are saying we can't do
Okay.
this.
Okay, Mr. Hawes, do you have an example?
I do, in fact, and so a tangible example of this would be for projects that we've been involved in where pile driving, for example, was involved. And so through the normal course of pile driving, even if it's done correctly, there can be damages to adjacent properties. It's been our experience that the Corps has viewed that as being, that liability as being indemnified, essentially. We believe that should be a project cost. It's something that occurs in the normal course of doing business, of constructing projects. And again, we think it should be a shared project cost, not the responsibility of the non-federal sponsor.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that example. Thank you.
Senator Capito.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Senator Fetterman. I just have a quick question. We've kind of dug down deep on the indemnity thing, I think, understand that issue. Let's talk about the operation and maintenance responsibility in perpetuity, trying to figure out ways to improve that. So you're saying, you said, I think Ms. Wallace, you said that, or somebody said that you have to sign these agreements at the 35% design phase. Is that correct? Or is that the, is that
It's even in planning.
even in the planning? Okay. So how would you improve that besides just wiping the whole thing out, which that's not going to happen, we don't think. So, I mean, what would you say, Mr. Hague, that would have meaningful impacts?
Right. So I believe in your opening statement, you referred to sort of the useful life of the project, and I think that's a concept that might be very helpful to latch on to. We've talked a lot about the operations and maintenance responsibility. I mean, I think in truth, it's an operations, maintenance, repair, rehabilitation, and replacement responsibility. So it's an even longer acronym if you pull it out. And so that final R of that acronym is replacement. And I think that kind of requirement also can be particularly problematic for a sponsor when they're signing a PPA very early on in the process to consider having to replace a project over and over and over again. In our experience, mostly in the ecosystem restoration realm, you could imagine situations where you have a useful life of project, you've achieved the project purposes, you've sort of restored natural functioning, and it would be tremendously helpful for the sponsors if there was a way to tie the end of their obligations some way to that useful life of a project, so that we know going in that there is an end point somewhere down the line.
Okay, good suggestion. Ms. Wallace, do you have a suggestion?
That end-defined period is so important. As Mr. Hague said, there's an obligation, and that obligation is to the Corps per the design manual, the O&M manual. And so
Right.
at
That
some
they give
point-
you at the end,
that
but
they
you
give-
don't impact it. Okay, I got that. too.
Yeah, at the ribbon cutting. And so the question becomes, can the sponsor then decide what to do with that replacement? Or is it beholden to the federal government?
I see.
And so at the end of a design period, at least there's a cap on who that obligation is to, if it's to their local tax base, to themselves, or to the federal government.
Mr. Haas, do you have any suggestions in there?
I would reiterate Mr. Hague's comments that the useful, reasonable sort of life of the project is the operative language that should be used.
Is that is that a standard that you can find? I mean, is that something that the Corps, you would say, okay, this dam is going to last 45 years. That's the useful life. I mean, are those measurements out there to be able to figure that out?
They are. The projects that we're involved with the Corps typically have a design life and a period of analysis associated
They
with
do,
them, and
okay.
so that is well-defined, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you. Sorry I have to duck out, but I appreciate it, and it's good to see everybody. Thank you.